global order dominated by the United States and their European vassals most rapidly in 2014. The coup in Ukraine, the special military operation, the war with Iran. Proper understanding of what's going on. These governments are acting on behalf of the hegemonic imperialist interests of this transnational oligarch class. They could isolate China and then prepare to target China. Piracy, war, and global economic depression.
That's a key point.
And the planet has no choice. And it's tough for liberals. It's tough for liberals to understand this.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Today we're joined by Billy Bob, a podcast host. Hello, Billy.
Hi, Daria. Thank you for inviting me.
Could you please share about your podcast?
Podcast is called Blowback, Exposing Imperial Decline. I think we just finished episode 199. So this morning, right before our program here, I finished our 199th episode. Not a lot of viewers, but basically I have some great co-hosts and some great guests. And we primarily talk geopolitics, but we also talk ideology, philosophy, and things like that, because I think they're all kind of interrelated. I'm anxious to do the same in this interview. Looking forward to it.
Take a minute to watch some great episodes. Today we'll talk about the UK's actions at sea, sanctions, international law, and the wider context from geopolitics to reparations and colonial legacy. All right, let's dive in. Prime Minister Starmer has effectively authorized the seizure of vessels belonging to the so-called Shadow Fleet in British territorial waters. How do you assess these actions under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and the principle of freedom of navigation?
So I appreciate you giving me these questions in advance. And so I have thought about them. And my first answer is probably going to be more long-winded than the next few answers because I kind of want to contextualize things. Because I don't think we can really understand, isolated events without understanding the broader context. And as a Marxist-Leninist, a socialist, I kind of have the context of class struggle. And so I kind of argue that we are in a era, with the Soviet Union, abolishing itself in 1991. We were left with a unipolar global order, dominated by the United States and their European vassals. Also, of course, vassals in Asia and Australia. And what they've, what they're up to right now is that they're worried about these rising sovereign powers, primarily Iran, Russia, and China. And so you have Western imperialism worried about maintaining their global hegemony, and they're interested in defeating what they perceive to be threats to their hegemonic global interests. And so it's within that context that these things are taking place, and we're seeing things really rapidly develop. Most rapidly in 2014, right, with the coup in Ukraine, and then the special military operation, and then the war with Iran that we're seeing right now. So, in my opinion, these are all connected, and they're all important. They're all relevant, and they're relevant to your specific question. So, and then I want to talk about ideologically, right? I think it's important to understand that a proper understanding of what's going on. You have two different frameworks from which you can understand things. There's the typical liberal framework, which perceives, individual nation states pursuing their national interest in a chaotic environment, in an anarchic environment where there's really no higher power enforcing the rules, right? And so you have stronger powers taking advantage of weaker powers, et cetera. So that's kind of a basic liberal framework. But, in the Marxist-Leninist framework, we understand the concept of imperialism, and we understand the concept of oppositional class interests and how the ownership class wants to be the ruling class of the nations. And so where the ownership class has become the ruling class of the nations, they've created an empire. And so I don't think it's really appropriate to see distinctions between nation states in the way that liberals do. So I think it makes more sense to understand, what I like to describe as a transnational Western oligarchy that controls the governments of the nation states of Europe and the United States, Japan, South Korea, Australia. So and these governments are not acting in any rational concept of what the national interest is. So these governments are acting on behalf of the hegemonic imperialist interests of this transnational oligarch class. And so this is a better way to understand and explain the things that you're asking me about, today. So and it's tough for liberals. It's tough for liberals to understand this because liberals don't think in terms of class. They don't think in terms of class struggle, and they kind of reject this concept of class and imperialism. Again, they see nation states, further, trying to pursue their national interests. And that's just a real limiting framework that is going to get you confused when you look and see what's going on. So when you look and see what's going on, I think a much better explanation is you have a transnational oligarchy that controls the governments of nation states of Europe and the United States, and they're using the nation states. They're using the economies. They're using the militaries of these nation states, not to further the national interest, but to further the hegemonic interests of the transnational oligarchs who are, again, engaged in an effort to, deal with these threats as they see them and the challenges and threats of sovereign countries like Iran, like Russia, and like China. And we haven't seen much on the China front, but we have seen escalation on the Russia front and on the Iran front. Now, the last thing before I really get into your question, I'm so sorry, is this idea about the global order, the rules-based order, how it has existed since 1945, and especially how it's existed since 1991. So you've had a unipolar power. The Western Empire has been, unrivaled in its power since 1991, especially, but really since 1945, because at the end of World War II, thanks to the sacrifice of the Soviet people and the Chinese people, the United States ended up being the biggest beneficiary of that war, and they accounted for half the global economy and just 5% of the global population. And so with that, tremendous imbalance in wealth and power, they really were the most influential in creating the global system that has resulted and that we've known for the past 80 years. So the rules-based order, they call it, has existed since 1945. But there was a Cold War, right? And there was competition between the Soviet Union and the United States. And that really changed in 1991 when the Soviet Union was dismantled. And so the thing is about this rules-based order, it's important for people to understand that this rules-based order was not really based in rules. It was really based in power. And the rules were designed to legitimize, the status quo, but they really weren't enforced equally, right? So the powerful were able to exploit and utilize the rules to benefit themselves and extract, resources and wealth from weaker countries, the global South, the developing world. So your questions deal with specific, policies that and the structure of the rules-based order. And it's important for people to understand that this structure wasn't really created for fairness. It wasn't really created for justice or for the benefit of humanity. It was created to benefit the strong powers to the detriment of the weak, and to perpetuate and maintain that system. And also to give it the legitimacy, a veneer of legitimacy, that doesn't actually exist. So, okay. So Starmer recently, he's threatening to attack, Russian ghost ships. So there's a war on Russia. There's a war being waged against Russia because Russia is sovereign and Russia is not, submitting to the rule of the Western oligarchs. And so there's a war being waged, a strategy being waged against Russia, and they're really trying to harm their economy, right? And so with the start of the SMO, we saw a whole bunch of sanctions being rolled out. And they really thought that they could reduce Russia's economy, and they failed. Like, Russia has been resilient, they've been strong, and to Russia's credit, they've really, dashed the hopes that the West had that they could just, easily defeat Russia. And by so doing, they could isolate China and then prepare to target China. Like this was the hope. But they haven't given up. So the West hasn't given up. You see more and more attacks on Russia's energy exports, right? So Russia is exporting energy. They have energy production and refinery capacity that is constantly being under attack from Ukrainian drones and missiles, Western really, not just Ukrainian. And then also the ships that are transporting this energy to various allies and countries across the globe who need it are being more and more interdicted. And then, so Starmer is using this idea of international law. He's actually using domestic law. He's using the domestic law to justify what is essentially just piracy, saying that, we are going to enforce our domestic law against international countries, two different countries who have, they don't have any jurisdiction. They don't have any jurisdiction. And so it's again, it's the case of, the West is simply pretending to have a lawful justification to doing things that are entirely unjustifiable. And so they use words, they use their media to promote this perspective. And they use things like the ghost fleet or the ghost ships, that are, supposed to be spooky, and somehow, they're illegitimate. They're engaged in illegitimate acts, and so we have the right to interdict them and capture them and take them over. But there's really no lawful justification for it. It's simply, they're engaged in an effort to harm, as it's an escalating effort to escalate against Russia's economy in an effort to really harm it. So, like I said, my first answer was going to be the longest. I kind of had to present my framework, and then it's from that framework which I'm going to do my best to answer the specific question. So, they're just trying to shape the narrative to make it look like it's Russia's trade, their energy trade with other countries is illegitimate, and there's nothing illegitimate about it. They have every right. Russia has every sovereign right to trade with other sovereign nations. And so when they're attacked, it's just pure piracy. So that'll be my answer for question one.
That's interesting, and thank you for preparing a wide answer. But here's the bigger question: could this become a model for other countries?
Okay, so yeah, well, and that's the slippery slope, right? And so like you said, I mean, if Britain is declaring that they can just interdict on the high seas, any ship that they deem to be illegitimate, why couldn't Russia or China do the same thing? And so again, one point I failed to address in my previous answer is the idea that this rules-based order that the United States has created and benefited from for the past 80 years, they're finding it less and less beneficial for themselves. And so they're really engaged in an effort to trash it. And there's going to be a tremendous conflagration, a tremendous upheaval in the world order. And we're already seeing it, but we're just seeing the very beginning of it. And I expect it to really increase tremendously, even within hours, if the United States starts to bomb Iran and really, tries to destroy all of Iran's energy production capacity. Iran will reciprocate against the Gulf states. And then the West Asia will no longer be exporting oil for years to come. And that'll have a disastrous effect. So, but I think the United States is going to do this. I think they're doing it intentionally because they understand that they are no longer winning this game that they created, this game of the rules-based order. And so they're involved in a move away from their own rules-based order to a more law of the jungle thing that plays better to their strengths. So the strengths of the Western imperialists is their 800 military bases around the world. It's 11 aircraft carrier groups, and a blue water navy that can mess up shipping lanes. It can launch embargoes of countries and can really wreak havoc and just change the global economy as we've known it for the past 80 years. So I think that's what is underway. So again, it's a bad precedent for Britain to set, and the United States has already set it, too. So the U.S. did it first. Britain is now doing it, and you're going to see more of this, and it's bad for humanity, and it's going to be terrible for the global economy. But it's what the U.S. is pushing on the planet. And the planet has no choice because the United States is powerful and they have the power to force, all the things they're doing onto the rest of us. And we're going to be suffering. There's going to be a lot of sacrifice going on because of these choices made by this transnational elites and their puppet governments, like the government in Britain, led by Keir Starmer, who's extremely unpopular. And he's going to, they're going to be doing things that are very unpopular and they're going to cause a lot of problems for people. And so it's a slippery slope. And they're moving us away from an order based on justice and fairness and into power and violence and the ability to just impose your power upon people, because again, that's their strength, right? With their 800 military bases around the world, their 11 aircraft carriers, they want to move things to a paradigm where that plays to their strengths instead of legitimacy and rules. They want to get away from things like legitimacy and rules.
All right. So the UK refers to the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Act 2018, the Policy and Crime Act 2017 as the legal basis for detaining tankers and prosecuting crews. Can this be seen as a legitimate legal framework, or it's an attempt to replace international law with domestic law?
It's the transnational oligarchs giving themselves a veneer of legitimacy and a veneer of justice and legality, and it's totally illegitimate. It's totally bankrupt morally. Thinking of terms of justice, there's no rationale for it. So yeah, they're citing domestic law in the interdiction of an international trade, between two other sovereign countries. And so I would agree that it is not legitimate, but it is illustrative of this move, away from a more rules-based order to a more might makes right order, a more law of the jungle order, and it threatens. It just threatens, everybody's well-being, because it opens up the precedent again for Russia to do that to British ships, for China to do that to American ships, and then what kind of a world is going to result? So not a good one.
Defense Secretary John Healey has spoken about a hard scenario, including boarding a vessel if the crew resists. Where is the line between enforcing sanctions and what could be considered piracy?
Again, sanctions enforcement, this idea of sanctions really is, again, it's the powerful trying to use the veneer of legality to justify, their interests, pursuing their core interests. And piracy is what it is. It's piracy. They're engaged in piracy. And we have precedent in history, right? So back in the I don't know, I guess colonial times, you would have privateers. You'd have privateers, and they were private, ships and their captains, and they would be given letters of marque from the government, and they would be told, "You are free." Like if you're British, right? Here, you get a letter of marque from the British government, and I want you to go and you can freely plunder any Spanish, trade ships or treasure ships that you find. We're at war with Spain. I'm going to give you this letter of marque. So now you're no longer a pirate. Now you're a privateer. And because you had the say so of the government, the okay from the government. But I mean, and that's just essentially what is going on here. It's piracy. The act is piracy, but you have this puppet government who doesn't represent the people of Britain. It doesn't represent the working class. It represents this transnational oligarch class that has no allegiance to Britain or any national interest. They have allegiance to the ruling class, to the oligarchs, and they are pursuing the hegemony of the oligarch class. And so they're engaging in piracy in furtherance of that effort. And that is the appropriate way to perceive that. And to fall for the idea that, oh no, it's all just because we have these domestic laws that we're going to cite as we do this thing does not change the fact of what it is.
Some argue this operation against the Shadow Fleet is an attempt by Starmer to gain a quick foreign policy win amid falling approval ratings and weaker UK influence in Europe. How much does this explanation make sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, that definitely plays a part. In my framework, we understand that these governments are not popular. Like none of the governments in Europe are popular at all. And we also know that they have really heavily invested in anti-Russia narratives, right? And so, unfortunately, the reality is a lot of people have been indoctrinated with a virulent Russophobia, right? They're really anti-Russian. And so there's probably true that, Starmer will have, the support of probably a minority of the people of Britain, to get a win like that. But there are also other considerations. If we understand that, the Western transnational oligarch class, is headquartered in the United States. It's headquartered in the United States, and then it has junior partners. So the junior partners are, of course, Western Europe and Britain, Australia, Japan, South Korea. And Britain is in an unusual situation because they're no longer part of the European Union. So they're interested in proving their worth to some extent, and that they are, that they're a good ally and an asset to Western to the overall imperialist objective, and to the United States specifically, where the headquarters is. And so, so they're hoping to, prove themselves to be useful in this effort to, harm Russia's economy, and further this broader strategy of global hegemony. I hope, people of Britain are not so fooled, and that they realize that, their government is really putting them down the path of catastrophe, because, the future is not looking good for Europe or for the UK, especially, with respect to the energy markets and deindustrialization, lack of jobs, the healthcare system is collapsing. Like, things are not looking good. And so it's important that the people of Great Britain and Europe, understand that this isn't Russia's fault, and it's not even really, the fault of a particular government. Again, the framework that people need to have in mind and embrace and appreciate is it's a transnational oligarchy that has captured the governments of all these countries, and it's forcing these governments to pursue policies that are not in the national interest. It is not in Britain's national interest to antagonize Russia, to try to defeat Russia economically. That is not going to end well for Britain, and the people of Britain ought to understand that, and they ought to oppose it, even though far too many are indoctrinated into supporting it. Is the sad reality.
The situation around the Chagos archipelago connects maritime policy with colonial history. The Diego Garcia base may be used to monitor shipping and possible seized vessels under the Shadow Fleet narrative. The question is, does the collapse of the deal with Mauritius reveal the UK's real strategic goals? And how
Right.
much influence might the US have had?
So, we've talked about colonialism, a little bit on the program. You mentioned it at the start of the program, and you just mentioned it in your question. It has to do a lot with colonialism, and colonialism again is the framework, the legal framework that the Western imperialists use to justify their unjustifiable acts and their unjustifiable motives, and their unjustifiable pursuit of their motives. So, so Diego Garcia, a super strategically important little island, what is that? The Pacific? It's part of the Pacific, the Indo-Pacific, I think, where it's located. And essentially, it was a Great British colony, right? So the Great Britain colonized it, and then probably after World War II, Mauritius got de facto independence, or de jure independence, but really, maintain being a colony of Great Britain, like a lot of other little islands around the world, they resulted from a legacy of British colonialism, because Britain was the biggest world power at one point and for a very long time. And using their navy, they were able to colonize so many little islands around the world, in the Caribbean, in the Indo-Pacific. So, but with the end of World War II and with liberalism, saying that colonialism were bad, Mauritius was able to obtain some sort of independence. But we can see that that kind of independence is not really existing in reality. It's negligible. And for instance, because Mauritius has said, okay, well, guess what? United Kingdom, you need to leave. You need to no longer have your bases, in our country. If we're a sovereign state, like, everybody says we are, you just need to take your military and go. And it's my understanding this is the U.S. Approach, is that no, we're in Diego Garcia legally because Britain has allowed us to use it, and Britain has a lease with Mauritius, and just because Mauritius says you can't lease it, we're still going to stay. So I mean, I'm kind of describing this threadbare bullshit veneer of colonialism, which still exists, and it's just a total affront to any sense of sovereignty. So the West likes to pretend that we're all just sovereign states, and every sovereign state has a right to determine its own future and pursue its own policies. But when those policies oppose or interfere with the strategies, the plans, the core interests of the empire, they just disregard. They totally disregard, and sovereignty goes right out the window. And so this is just a really good illustration of that. And the legal pretense that allows the United States to stay in Diego Garcia and use their real big military base there to further their war against Iran. And my assertion is we'll very soon be using Diego Garcia as an energy embargo of China. It's because they can it's an ideal location to interdict any kind of energy imports or even manufactured exports from China. And so there's no way that the United States is going to give up this really important strategic base just because the people that actually own it, the country of Mauritius, says to leave. They don't care. Mauritius has no power to do any of that. And so it just proves when push comes to shove, the facade, the liberal facade of sovereignty all goes out the window. And what really exists is imperialism, and it's the core interests of the transnational oligarchy that really dictates what happens. It's a result of colonialism, and that's the framework which allows them the fake justification not to leave. But Mauritius, of course, tells them to leave, but they're not going to. It's too strategically important of a place.
That's a key point. Statements by Reform UK linking visa policy to reparations have been seen by many in Africa and the Caribbean as pressure. Is this a fringe position or part of a broader shift in British politics, including among conservatives?
So, great question, and it really allows me to elaborate on, one of the ways in which the Western oligarchy, pursues its interests and extracts wealth, extracts resources from the underdeveloped countries. So, what happens is they will put in power a government of elites. The government of elites in any given African country often went to school, in the United States. Their kids will often go to school in the United States. This tiny minority of elite rulers in these underdeveloped countries will facilitate the extraction of wealth and resources from their country to Western corporations. And so what we see happening is the U.S. is threatening to blackmail these leaders. And the U.S. in this case, it's Britain, But again, I don't see a real big distinction between how Britain operates as a junior partner in the empire and the United States operates as the senior partner in the empire. They're threatening these governments, and they're saying, look, all of your privileges, your kids going to school at Harvard, your 3 homes here in the Hamptons, like we can just take all those, all your bank accounts. We can, if you don't do what we say, if you don't get on board with our efforts to defeat China, defeat Russia, defeat Iran. If you become intransigent, like we will undo all of your privileges. And so it's kind of a sort of blackmail that's being used to enforce, their global order and to, demand that these individual governments, acquiesce to imperialist strategy. It's overt. It's an obvious threat, and I mean, and so the question is, will it succeed? Probably some places with some people, but the hope is that you have some decent governments that really truly do care about the well-being of their own nation and their own people more than they care about their own, bank accounts or the fact that their kids are going to Harvard, and that they're going to put their nations first, and they're going to, at least remain neutral and not, fully get on board with the imperialist efforts to, what I think will be very soon is, crashing the global economy and, having a really big kind of war and global economic depression. I'm optimistic that China is, the people think highly enough of China, and China they see as a source of stability and fairness and all the things that the liberal West only pretends to embody, and is really embodied by China, and that these individual governments will see that they have an option, and that they don't have to throw their lot in with the West, and by doing so throw their own people under the bus, and that they can either remain neutral or outright side with China and say, we're not gonna put up with this neo-colonialism anymore, this extractive policy that doesn't benefit our country. So ideally, that's what we see happen, and I really hope we do. It's great to see strong countries like Russia resist. Iran is resisting, and they're both really under attack, and they're both really paying the price. And so it's tough. It's tough, like Venezuela. Ideally, Venezuela would have maybe put up more of a struggle, but like I can't ask them to sacrifice. I mean, their entire Venezuelan government was probably threatened by the United States with death. If you don't go along with this, we will murder all of you. And so, it's understandable that they have kind of acquiesced, because we see kind of Venezuela's acquiesced, and they're no longer shipping oil to Cuba, for instance, and a lot of it's coming to the U.S. to help the U.S. So it's tough. I mean, these little countries are in a tough situation, and so often it's hard to blame them for feeling like they have to ally themselves with imperialism. And the blackmail that you spoke of is one of the ways that the United States forces them to do that. But no, I have great hope, Daria. I have a lot of optimism that the West's efforts are futile, that China is not going to be defeated, that Russia is not going to be defeated, and that Iran is not going to be defeated, and that the West is just hastening their own decline. And so my podcast is called Blowback, Exposing Imperial Decline. Every episode we're talking about how this decline is taking place. And so I do want to take the moment to plug that. But also, this is the second time you've had me back. Thank you for reaching out to people like myself and giving us a platform to kind of talk about things in a different way that is talked about in the actual media. And I think it's super important to do that. Because, the echo chamber, the echo chamber, the media sphere in the West is really, really awful. I was just making the point about how awful the Western media is, and how the Western media doesn't exist to inform people or explain what's going on. It exists to facilitate, the strategy and the interests of the ruling class. And so if people just, watch the news, they're going to be really, really misinformed. and they're actually going to be tricked into supporting policies and things that are against their own interests. And so that's just why it's important for programs like yours and programs like mine to try and do their best to, provide an antidote and provide an alternative perspective of things instead of just, what the ruling class, wants us to hear and think. And so I thank you for inviting me, and I think it's just a super important time right now that more than ever people are aware and informed and understand what is going on.
I can't disagree with your point. And Billy, thank you. Really appreciate your insights, your thoughts, and thanks everyone for watching. If you enjoyed this, like, subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comments. See you in the next time.